Hi, my name's Sinan Kubba, I'm a contributing editor at Joystiq, and my favourite game of the last 10 years is Dark Souls. So first off, let's be clear, choosing between Dark Souls and Demon Souls was incredibly tough for me. So tough in fact that I wasn't able to not put both of them in my personal top 10. I just went with both. I still don't feel certain about going with Dark Souls as my final pick. That extends beyond Souls games. But here we are. So, why did I go with Dark Souls? Both of the first two Souls games are undeniably punishing, and they particularly stand out in a time when mainstream gaming still seems afraid to ask too much of the player for fear of shutting him or her out. The Souls games have no such qualms, and both of From's action RPGs aren't afraid to rob the player of huge amounts of progress, both in terms of Souls collected, Souls being the currency for boosting a character, but also for all those minutes that you lose. 20 minutes, half an hour, I can't even count how many minutes I feel like I've lost this game. That's what ostensibly is happening, but beneath the surface not one single second is really and truly wasted in a Souls game. Each terrible failure, be it at the hands of a giant spider, or just losing your footing on a narrow walkway, each one is always valuable, and that's because you're always learning something from the games. By sticking to rigid enemies that respawn always in the same place with their equally rigid movesets and behaviour, essentially by making the game learnable and predictable, the cruelty of the Souls games becomes entirely masterable. The trick is learning how to cope with them, and in the case of the game's often severe adversity, to maintain your composure. It is a real, genuine challenge. Both Souls games aren't just about the difficulty though, and that phrase has almost become as cliche as developers using Dark Souls as a buzzword for difficulty. But it is true, there is so much more to the Souls games. The worlds themselves, they aren't just nightmares pulled out of nowhere, but they're intricately designed to sit somewhere between environmental storytelling and allowing for a real, free interpretation that often deepens a love for a game. A lot of games try and fail at this approach, but the Souls games keep their clues small and yet engaging enough that you want to learn more, or at least ruminate on it. I just remember finding myself obsessed with those poor, wretched people at the bottom of Anor Londo, just banging their fists against the ground, and I just kept wondering, why were they doing it? Why were they in so much despair? It just made that whole area a bit darker. Somehow the games combine their dark, desolate worlds with a sense of multiplayer, without one ruining the other. I think placing other players in their separate games, but in your own game as shadows that you see playing alongside you, bloodstained deaths that you can replay, or messages from these players that you read, and so on. That's the real genius move of these games. It gives everything a sense of shared adventure and shared struggle, that we are all little Davids in this world, trying to take down this giant Goliath that is the video game. The invasions and often horribly misleading player messages, yeah, they do negate that idea admittedly, but when you're at your lowest ebb, you're willing to overlook that. I guess what pushes Dark Souls ahead of Demon Souls for me, just so slightly, is how unique that open world in Dark Souls is. Whereas Demon Souls goes with an essentially linear approach, dungeons that are essentially chapters, detached from one another, Dark Souls goes with a totally traversable world, bonfires being checkpoints in this world that you can bank your souls at. The sheer full verticality of the Dark Souls world is what makes it really stand out to me. So many vertical games, or so-called vertical games, are just a bunch of raised platforms, great big lies against the y-axis. But Dark Souls is like a house, a little mansion of despair with some terrible nightmare lurking in each of its rooms. It is so perfectly summated by that opening area, that area through the undead village taking you up to the Berg and into the church. It just twists and turns so much, and it's so disorientating. Eventually you defeat the gargoyles, and then you take that lift down, and then you're back in that initial hub where you started, and it feels like you've been on a journey around the houses, which you kind of have, literally. The game uses space in ways that most other games waste, and I find that incredible. Because it has such a compact world that twists and turns in so many directions, it's really difficult to visualise at first, but the more you trek, the more you learn it, and I found I learned it better than any other video game I've played. Again, the game's systems and its immense challenge make that a necessity. If you're bad at orientating your way through games, Dark Souls is the best crash course. And when a game leaves you with such a lasting imprint of its world, of its characters, of its systems, it's difficult to move past that game as your favourite for the last 10 years. But ultimately, there are two reasons I've really gone with Dark Souls. It's provided, I think, across its huge length, overall the most fun I've had with a video game in the last 10 years. And that is really saying a lot. There have been some incredible video games in the last 10 years, as I've said before. But first and foremost, It provided me my favourite moment of the last 10 years, beating that game for the first time. And I was lucky enough to play it pre-release when there were just a smattering of messages and bloodstains around, very few other players to talk to, and really so much of it was done of my own accord, trying to work out these things without any help. And that was a real, enjoyable, fundamentally fantastic challenge, and I can't think of any other game that provided an experience like it. I still think, even if I'd played it after release and had all those messages, it would still end up being my favourite game of the last 10 years. That's how good it is. But really that moment stood out to me, and I enjoyed it so much. It was such a satisfying challenge, not just because the difficulty was so high, but because the overall experience, the overall game, is just so well designed, so humble in terms of how it looks, but beneath that kind of rough aesthetic is this really incredibly cleverly designed game. So that's why I picked Dark Souls as my favourite game of the last 10 years. It provided me with a moment I just will not probably forget for another 10, 20, 30, 40 years of gaming. It's just a magical, fantastic game. Well done from Software. Thank you so much.